This is a short history of Putah Creek and its fish, focusing on salmon, which are the subject of today's town hall meeting. And I'd like to remind people that lower Putah Creek, where we're talking about, is a very different system than it was 500 years ago, which before the Euro-American invasion of the Central Valley. And this is shown sort of best in the Cunningham's great book on the state of change, with her imaginations of what this habitat was like. And this shows you quite likely a good image of what lower Putah Creek was like, especially around Davis here and all the way down into what's now the bypass. A couple of meandering channels and very dense wetlands with a huge diversity of habitat and a huge diversity of organisms. And salmon were part of this. They are mainly in the main rivers, but they no doubt came up to the smaller streams like Putah Creek as well, probably going all the way up into the Berryessa Valley. But they were a very important part of the ecosystem, and very important also for the Native Americans who lived here, the Putwin people. We have to recognize that they were here as an integrative part of the system. And they depended very much on fish, not just on salmon, but on other fish as well for sustenance. And, it's interesting now that the university likes to put this statement in a lot of their presentations and so forth, and I certainly can't disagree with it. Just acknowledging that for thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. And today there are 3 federally recognized tribes that are still active in the area. So there's always been a human presence in the valley. The presence of different groups is, they have different weights, and we have not been especially kind to the creek. The creek we're talking about starts out with Monticello Dam and flows down across Yolo County and Sonoma County down into the Yolo bypass. But as I say, it's a very different stream than it was historically. And let me explain this. This is a shot of Putah Creek from an airplane near the campus. But imagine this in the 19th century, of all the things that had happened since the 19th century to the creek that made it into a totally different stream than it was when the Putwin people were living here. First off, the first thing the farmers did to prevent flooding was to construct levees. And you can see these levees in this photo here. Those levees were very important first step, because not only did they reduce the flooding of the ag fields, but they also caused the water as it came roaring out of the coast range, caused the water to cut down and create a very narrow and very deep channel. The one that we see today, when you paddle canoe down it, you're looking up on ag land. That's a phenomenon caused by the levee construction and the down cutting of the creek. So the wetlands were drained, and riparian trees were removed. So the farmers and so forth around here really preferred a barren channel, because there was less fewer things that could come crashing down on your bridges and so forth. And on top of all that, we introduced lots of non-native species, everything from plants to fish to even mammals that are part of the system. So the system has a mixture of native and non-native species in it as well. We still get some high flows today. This is the last major ones in 2017, but they're still kind of confined between the levees. They're still important, but this picture showing all this riparian vegetation, that is, again, a fairly recent phenomenon. Well, let me show you now some aerial photographs of Putah Creek near Winters that Rich Marovich provided, showing you how the creek has changed. Here you can see Putah Creek it's flood right here in the 1940s. You can see some of the orchards are partly flooded. Even some houses apparently are flooded. But also notice it's just this very thin band of riparian trees higher up on the levees. The channel itself is basically bare, very little habitat in the channel. Then when you move upstream, that's where the great fish habitat was. This goes into the Berryessa Valley, and this is where the salmon were headed for. The salmon and steelhead that migrated upstream. Even in those years when the lower channel was stripped bare, salmon were coming up, and there was good records of them spawning in the Berryessa Valley. And this old family photo right here shows the kids on their horses, but this is also a gravelly plain they're on, a great place for salmon to spawn. So up through the 1950s, when a dam was built on Hell's Gate here, at least the Berryessa Valley had some habitat for salmon. This is what it looked like. I loved it in the 1950s before it was covered by Lake Berryessa. I love to imagine what this must have been like even before Europeans settled the area. So let me have the Solano project. This is the next big mover changer of the system. It's built by the Bureau of Reclamation. It includes Monticello Dam and Berryessa Reservoir. The reservoir has a capacity of 1.6 million acre feet, which is huge, considering all things considered. It's one of the bigger reservoirs in the state. Then that goes down to the Putah Creek Diversion Dam and Solano Reservoir. This whole project was completed in 1957, and the creek's never been the same. It's managed by it's managed by the Solano Water Agency, and it delivers waters to the farmers, the cities, the military bases, and to UC Davis. So it's the foundation of our prosperity in Yolo County. It also, of course, is used for flood control. And at the time the dam was built, nobody worried about fisheries because they figured the fishery would develop in the reservoir and also in the tailwater of the dam. That tailwater being this reach between the reservoir right here and Solano Reservoir. This just gives you a rough diagram of what I was just talking about. But the key thing is that most of the water today gets diverted down the Putah South Canal to benefit the farms and cities of Solano County. And it's all because of Monticello Dam. I love to use this photograph, also taken from a plane, showing you this very thin wall that is holding back all those millions of acre feet of water in the hills. And of course, this is built on an earthquake fault. We always should keep that in mind and be a little humble about everything we've done here. But then you're going back to the creek here. The creek net flows are now controlled by the dam. So, but it still in the 1960s was pretty much a creek with no one is taking much responsibility for. A little bit more riparian vegetation, probably still some salmon coming up on occasion, but not very many. And here, even up in the 1970s, you see more riparian vegetation developing. Some pools have been created by the dams that were built down here. The system was kind of much more friendly to fish, but still not that great for salmon. But nobody was keeping track. There was some work done in the 1950s that showed there were salmon runs, but after that, people sort of wrote off Lower Putah Creek. In the 1990s, what you hear, you get to see you see the creek before the restoration projects. A lot of riparian vegetation of various sorts on the banks, and more of a stream. But down here, at least we have some water coming out of the dam to satisfy some riparian rights. So it was not completely barren. But then when you look at what the Putah Creek was like, basically it had become it changed from being this wandering stream that went back and forth across the landscape, creating diverse habitats and flooding lots of areas, to being this channel that goes through this very rich farmland with riparian vegetation on both sides. It's actually pretty good habitat for a lot of different things, but it's a totally artificial habitat in so many respects. And this is a creek that had a long history of abuse. After the dam was built, after Monticello Dam was built, and the lower creek was written off, it became a depository for old car bodies and refrigerators, which are still there. This is a photo I took in 1991. They're still there up to the early 1990s. The university mined gravel out of the creek. So again, it's shown at a time a total disrespect for what was left of the creek. But then things really got heated up, so to speak, when we had a big drought in 1989 and Putah Creek started to dry up. There was no real water provided for the lower reaches, but it tended to flow in most years anyway. But the Putah Creek Council had just been formed at this time. And so suddenly they had a major problem in front of them that the creek they're setting up to protect was suddenly disappearing. Here's a picture of a beaver dam that's dry, for example. And the fish died. There's an amazing number of fish that died in the creek, even little catfishes. And herons and egrets came from all over to feed on the fish. This is a picture taken below Mace Boulevard. Again, you see a dead car in the creek and a stagnant pool of just very, very disgusting place. Well, this, of course, resulted in the lawsuit with the Putah Creek Council joined forces with the city of Davis and the University of California to sue the Solano County Water Agency in the Sacramento Superior Court. That was in 1996. And really, it was all about flows, because flows were the master variable that kept this creek, made the creek what it is. You know, flows are what regulates the temperature. They water the riparian plants, provide habitat for fish. They dilute whatever pollutants are in the creek, floats the boats. It does all kinds of things. It turns a barren channel into a living entity almost. And I always like to point out that one of the reasons the trial was successful was that every year we had classes going down to the creek and sampling the fish where the university used to be mining gravel. And this data set was started in the late 1970s, was the only real data of it available for the fish in the creek. That was an older data set besides data that was collected after the lawsuit was filed. So this was a very important role that the students played at that time. Well, in April 1996, the creek wins its battle in court, and it was declared a public trust resource. But it took another 4 years before we had the Putah Creek Accord, where the Solano Water Agency and all the various entities got together and shook hands and decided that we would have a living creek again. And ever since then, it really has worked out that way. There has been true partnership with the Solano County Water Agency taking the lead in so many of the developments and projects. And the basis of the creek, the way we have it today, where it's bringing back these salmon runs, is that first off, it's a living stream. It's a continuous flow to the Yolo bypass. It has spring flows for native fishes and elevated flows for native fish spawning and rearing. Then in the fall, there's a pulse flow for salmon. They help bring the salmon up to spawn. And then we also would like to have high flows to keep keep an active channel in the creek. They're not written into the agreement, but they seem to come often enough. And we're also to make it work. And also, of course, we're willing to use bulldozers and things to make things work as well. But here's the basic result from looking at data fish data before and after the agreement is that when we first started out, what fish there were in the remnants of the creek were non-native alien species. Today, when you go to most of these areas, it's dominated by native species, including salmon. That's a big switch and really a nice success story. Some of these fishes, I'm sure rainbow trout, both between the dams and right below Solano Diversion Dam. Steelhead are not present as far as we know, though. Tule perch, one of my favorite little fish. This is a photograph taken in the creek. a little perch that's only found in California, a very unique species. And a bunch of other native fishes as well, from lampreys, hitch, and even this is a baby salmon again, part of the fauna of the creek. So what we have today is a Putah Creek, which is a novel lake ecosystem, which I also like to talk about as reconciliation, ecology, and action. It's novel in the sense it has only a superficial resemblance to the historic ecosystem, because you sort of have a creek in the same place it was before, only it doesn't move back and forth across the landscape. But it's dominated by a pretty diverse flora and fauna, but it's a mixture of native and non-native species. And they seem to get along. That's one of the impressive things. And so what we've done is created a reconciled ecosystem where there's habitat for native species in a human-dominated landscape. And of course, this only happens because we're in charge. We're the gods of Putah Creek that make it work for the way we want it to work, which is why there's always going to be work for people to do to maintain this creek. And of course, the star of the show these days is the Chinook salmon, which have come up to spawn, which Mackenzie will talk about. And it's really been one of the wonderful developments because salmon really are charismatic. So, Mackenzie, take it away. And do I need to stop my share?
Perfect. Oops. Okay, can you guys see that okay?
Yep, I can see it.
Maybe?
Yeah.
There we go. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. I feel really humbled and flattered, in fact, to be here this evening presenting with Peter and Rich. They're both really great examples of stewardship and service. This is a really neat opportunity for me. Before I get started, I'd like to note here that there have been so many wonderful people that have made contributions to this project over the years, all of whom I'd like to thank. Okay, and I think with that, I'll just jump right in. I'm going to share with you some of the tools we use to study salmon in the creek and what some of those tools might tell us about the creek's future. Okay, get my little laser pointer out. Okay. Really briefly, before I dive in, here I have the salmon life cycle, which I saw you all pop in. I know a lot of you are familiar, but for those of you who might not be, I'm going to go through it really quick. Since I'm a student, I generally think of the year as an academic cycle, so I'm going to start with the adults in the fall. Fall-run salmon begin their migration upstream in the really early fall, sometimes really late summer. And then once they begin that migration, once they get to the spawning grounds, they'll create redds, which are just essentially gravel nests. They'll deposit their eggs and then guard the redd until they die, at which time we conduct carcass surveys. Then their babies will emerge from the gravel redd like 60 to 70 days after deposition. And then those fish will grow in the freshwater like crazy, and that's when we'll try to capture them in the rotary screw trap. As they get bigger, they'll begin to smolt, which is the physiological process by which they're preparing to live in salt water. And that's when we'll try to track their movements with acoustic telemetry. Once out of freshwater systems, the salmon will then grow in the food-rich habitats of the ocean for about 2 to 4 years, usually before they begin the cycle again by migrating upstream. Okay, so the rest of the talk, I'll try to quickly walk through those methods that I just mentioned and share some of our data with you. Every year we conduct adult carcass surveys in Putah Creek. We generally begin within a few days of the flashboards being removed at the Los Rios check dam. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry, I'll explain it in just a second, but that's essentially the gate that dictates movement in and out of the creek. We'll then continue our carcass surveys until we have seen no new carcasses for consecutive weeks. We perform these surveys from canoes for the best vantage point and to avoid damaging any redds. And this photo here is an image of a carcass survey being performed by a couple of our former lab members. over the last 5 years, we've seen numbers of salmon vary greatly. The numbers I have displayed here are raw counts of salmon. So these are all salmon we've handled individually. And so in other words, these are the minimum counts of salmon. I'll later be fleshing out these numbers to try to better estimate population in the creek as part of my thesis. And because I know these numbers are pretty scary to look at right now, especially 2019 and 2020, because 2016, 2017, and 2018 looked pretty promising. There was even an upward trend in returning adults. But although we only saw one carcass in 2019, we did see a couple dozen live fish in the creek. But when there's probably so few of them, it's likely that something else is getting to them before we get to them, like other scavengers. In 2019 and 2020, in particular, fish were not able to pass up into Putah Creek until later in the year, closer to mid to late November, whereas in those earlier years, fish were able to move upstream in late October or early November. And I'll explain in just a second why that's so impactful. Okay, so let me orient you to this graph really quick. On the x-axis is date, and on the y-axis is fork length. And fork length is just the size of the fish. But essentially what you're seeing here in blue dots is a single adult, or an occurrence of capture, if you will. And so this was data that was all collected in the tow drain downstream of Putah Creek. Putah Creek flows into the tow drain where it ends. And this is to illustrate the timing of observed adult upmigration from 2015 to 2017. Generally, we see the gates to Putah Creek open in early November, which I've roughly estimated here with a yellow line. But sometimes, based on other water needs, they won't come out until mid to late November. And sometimes, I don't think it's happened yet, but I think technically the boards could stay into December 15th. So when they come out earlier, it's really the result of us coordinating and collaborating with other people. But we see here that if we're only opening Putah Creek up in late October or early November, half of the salmon present in the system may just be bypassing Putah Creek. Nevertheless, managing fish in Putah Creek is still new to a lot of us, and it's an adaptive process, and we can only know what the data we've collected to date tells us so far. But besides natural timing and check dam removal, there are a myriad of other things, both man-made and natural, that contribute to varying numbers of salmon. On the left is a picture of the check dam that I was talking about, and all these boards, these are the flash boards. And on the right is a picture of a beaver dam that we rediscovered this year that likely blocked passage upstream for adults for a period of time before we notched it. And most of the time, salmon can probably navigate beaver dams, but as I'm hoping this picture illustrates, this is a particularly impressive beaver dam. It's probably about 2 meters tall. And in addition to these factors at work within Putah Creek, there are an infinite number of other elements at play beyond the creek. Ocean conditions are variable, temperatures are changing, the forage base that feeds salmon in the ocean is in flux, not to mention conditions in the delta and the rivers that the salmon also have to navigate before getting to Putah Creek. But thankfully, we've begun to identify the things within the creek that can be remedied. There's now a subcommittee that's been formed to address the beaver dam, and there's more communication between researchers and managers. The LPCCC has been really great in that respect, and we're building partnerships within the community with farmers and property owners. Okay, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the adults, we collect a lot of things from the carcasses when we encounter them, but I think one of the coolest tools we have are otoliths. And I'd like to briefly go through just a few things an otolith can tell us about a fish's life and how we can leverage that tool to give us insight to the Putah Creek adults. This is a close-up of an otolith through a microscope, and you can see here the daily growth rings. I hope that's obvious on your end. But this is essentially a daily record of the fish's life. The rings can tell us where they spent time during different stages of their lives, how old they are, and the rate at which they grew. And just to make it more apparent, these are a pair of otoliths that I pulled from a fish this fall. And I just wanted to share these with you because I think they're so neat To me, they look like little angel wings almost. Okay, and these are some of the resulting data from otolith analysis. And don't worry too much about the details of this plot. I'll try to explain it. But this plot actually comes from an article that my friend Malta Willems published just this year. And if you saw the Creek Speak that we did in the fall, Malta probably explained this way better than I could, so check that out. But his article is really interesting and thought-provoking and tells us a lot about Putah Creek salmon. If you'd like to read it, I included a link down here in the slides. But what I'm using this graph to do is to highlight the distribution of origins we saw in Putah Creek in 2016. We can see that because of the isotope ratios present in the early life stage of those rings, so the rings that were much closer to the core, on the left side of the screen on the picture I just showed you, that a great majority, or 88%, of those adults were found to be from Central Valley hatcheries. But there was information that pointed to a few wild fish in the system. In the future, I think we expect these numbers to begin shifting to the right as we begin to see, hopefully, adults return who had spent time in Putah Creek as juveniles. Otoliths are a really cool tool that we use in the creek now, but that we plan on using much more in the future. This is just 1 year. We have otoliths from 2016 as well as the last 4 years. Okay, now that I've quickly gone over how we monitor adults and some of that data, I want to chat briefly about juveniles. Over the last few years, like the adult numbers, the juvenile numbers have also varied greatly. Some of this variation is the result of water years or a pandemic, and I'll address some of those changes later. But for now, these are our raw counts of juveniles. So far, 2018 is our most thorough data set. But 2021 isn't shaping up too poorly. So far, we've processed well over 4,000 juveniles since the end of March. I think I hit 4,000 genetic samples this week. And I'm still capturing Chinook in the trap every day. And this is our trap this year. Here I have displayed a summary of our rotary screw trap catch from 2017 to 2019, overlaid with discharge. And discharge is a measure of flow in the creek. On the left axis is our count of juvenile salmon captured in the trap each day, and on the other axis is discharge. It's worth noting here on this graph that 2018 was a relatively dry year, while 2017 and 2019 were wetter years. It's relative to note the difference in CFS here. If I hadn't scaled the 2018 data, this discharge line would look really, really small at the bottom of this graph and might not be able to tell us very much. And so our sampling seasons aren't always the same, because in wet years like 2017 and 2019, it can be difficult and sometimes unsafe for us to operate our screw trap. This was our screw trap in 2017. And so this explains a little bit of the difference in our sampling window each year and why we're not able to operate it as consistently as we would like. But anyhow, back to our data. I've highlighted here in a red box what I think is a delayed effect of a small peak in the hydrograph. This is meant to demonstrate the effect that even a small increase in flow might have on fish movement. And this is last year's data from the spring. And as most things in 2020, our spring sampling season didn't go as planned. We weren't able to deploy our rotary screw trap and instead deployed a pike net later in the season to try and capture what fish were still in the system. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, that's great, Mackenzie, why are you showing us so many of these graphs? And what I'm seeking to highlight is the importance of that natural flow pattern that Peter had mentioned. Because salmon are anadromous, they rely on environmental variability to give them cues that tell them, okay, it's time to move on. And that peak in the hydrograph, an increase in flow that also affects temperature, is a powerful cue. And this is our pike from last year, in case it's a little bit different than a lot of other pike nets, but I'm glad we were still able to sample in 2020. And while we still have a lot to learn about the reproductive success of salmon in Putah Creek, the fact that we've captured juveniles over the past 4 years indicates, or 5 years, excuse me, indicates that adults are spawning successfully in the creek. But what do we know about the relative success of juveniles? And this plot is supposed to tell you how the kids are doing. It displays condition factor of all juvenile salmon in the creek in the last 4 years. And condition factor is a metric used to assess the relative health of a fish by comparing its actual size to its expected size. And so a condition factor of 1 is considered a plump fish. So given this data, the juveniles in Putah Creek appear to be faring well. The average condition factor in all years is greater than 1. And this indicates to me that there's presumably an abundance of food to support growth and development. So essentially this means that the baby salmon in Putah Creek can grow into chunky footballs. And here are a few of our chunky footballs. The picture on the bottom was taken just a couple weeks ago. Okay, so now moving on to that last component of the life cycle that I mentioned in the beginning, and that's smolts. So far, we know that adults are returning. We know that they're spawning successfully because there are juveniles in the creek, but do we know that the juveniles are able to leave this creek successfully? That's one of the questions we're looking at by using acoustic telemetry. And acoustic telemetry is the process by which we implant a transmitter in the fish, and then that transmitter communicates with various receivers throughout the fish's exit. And as I'm hoping this map on the right illustrates to you, our little salmon have a pretty good ways to go to make it to the ocean. And there's a lot of hurdles for them to overcome even before leaving Putah Creek. And so to monitor this outmigration, we tag our smolts, which is the picture over on the left. That is I think that was like our 3rd or 4th tagging event this year. So it takes quite a lot of people, but we're able to get the fish out there with tags. And here on the left is a small visualization of what those transmitters pinging on receivers deployed in the creek would look like. And this is data from 2019. Each line of dots here, so like there's a line here, another line here. Each line of those dots is a receiver at a specific river kilometer that picked up the ping those transmitters are making. And you can see here that about 7 of the fish we tagged in 2019 made it out of Putah Creek. Unfortunately, due to a really small sampling window in 2019, we only captured about 29 salmon, and we probably only tagged 18. But this year, I've already tagged over 150 salmon, so I'm really hoping to improve on this data resolution. But 2019 served essentially as like a proof of concept year. We do know that salmon are making it out of the system later in the year. It's also possible that salmon are leaving the system earlier, and I just can't capture that because I'm limited by the size of our tags. As you can see here on the left, this is our tag, and this is our tag, and this is our salmon. And so the fish have to be of a certain size before we can tag them. So they might be leaving at a smaller size. This data also indicates to me that once the fish make the decision to leave, they do so fairly quickly. This is probably a couple of days, if that, from the time they were released to the time they exited the creek. And so, again, this is the transmitter, this is a fish to be tagged, and then this is the fish post-tagging. And you can see right here, I hope on your screen, a small incision that was sutured shut. Collaboration has really been key to any of the salmon work on the creek. Putah Creek is a multi-use water resource system, and so communication between various interest groups is really important. Folks up and down the creek have been really supportive and interested in the science that we do. And there are so many partners and stewards that help us navigate this puzzle of returning salmon. Each year, it seems we find a new piece of the puzzle to tweak. And one such puzzle piece is pictured here. This year, with the help of Los Rios Farms and a lot of coordination by Rich, we've decided, or they've notched the check dam. So essentially what this is doing is it's directing flow above the check dam and narrowing it so that salmon can better find their way out. Okay, as I wrap up my portion, I'd like to highlight the really exciting future of salmon research within Putah Creek. As I said, we're adding new components to the project every year as we learn more and more about salmon in Putah Creek. One of the more interesting components, I think, is genetic analysis. Over the last 5 years, we've collected genetic samples from adults and juveniles, and in so doing, we've been building a really giant catalog of genetics that will be used to evaluate the genetic heritage of salmon in the creek. And this is something called parentage-based analysis. This will help us to determine whether or not Putah Creek is on its way to establishing its own salmon run. And this will have ramifications for conservation at the federal and state level, because once the salmon are recognized as their own run, they can probably be managed a little differently. There are lots of other collaborative projects we're working on, but ultimately the message that I'd like to leave you with today is that researchers across disciplines, across groups, are utilizing dozens of different tools to study fish and better conserve them. These can then provide information to resource managers to make decisions on how to manage the population. And I think that Putah Creek is an excellent and unique blueprint for finely tuning management approaches to restore salmon populations with the use of fairly little water. And I think that Rich is up next, and he's going to tell you about some of the stuff we've already done in the future.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
I don't think you have it shared yet, Rich.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh, here we go. How about now?
There we go. Yeah, it's just not in presenter mode yet, but yes, we can see your presentation.
Very good. All righty. Well, the Lower Putah Creek Coordinating Committee was formed by the settlement agreement, the Putah Creek Accord, and it's a learning organization. And we've been at this for 20 years and we're still learning, particularly thanks to a great start, great foundation by Peter Moyle, coming up with a flow regime that successfully brought salmon back to Putah Creek. And Mackenzie's work is helping us to fine tune the timing of salmon attraction flows and helping us realize that we need to get salmon into the system earlier so that they can spawn and outmigrate sooner and have a better chance of riding the peak flows on the way back out. So this talk is focused on current and future actions to continue the recovery of salmon on Lower Putah Creek. Here's one of my favorite photos of salmon having their own town hall below Putah Diversion Dam in 2016. I'd like to give credit now to Ken W. Davis for this and other photos that I'll use throughout my presentation this evening. There are 3 types of salmon habitat enhancement projects: salmon passage, both for spawners and outmigrating juveniles; spawning habitat enhancement, chiefly loosening existing gravels called scarification on the floor of the channel so that salmon can use them for spawning; and improving rearing habitat primarily through the placement of woody debris. Salmon passage requires overcoming seasonal barriers, including Los Rios check dam, which could be done either through seasonal placement of a fish ladder or via a bypass channel, providing an alternative crossing at Road 106A, and breaching beaver dams. Beaver dams got a lot of attention this year because about 50 adult salmon were stranded downstream of the largest dam on Lower Putah Creek. But UCD showed us how to properly notch the dam to allow fish to pass in a way that does no lasting harm to beavers. Here's a map of the main salmon passage barriers. Los Rios check dam is in the Yolo bypass. Road 106A is about halfway between the tow drain and Mace Boulevard. And the massive beaver dam, the Grand Coulee of Putah Creek, is about a mile east of Mace Boulevard. Los Rios Check Dam impounds up to 12 feet of water with checkboards between April 1st and late October, or whenever the fall salmon attraction flow can be scheduled. Removal of the dam requires coordination with Department of Fish and Wildlife, who owns the land, and Los Rios Farms, who operates the dam. In recent years, it has not been possible to pull the boards as early as we would like because the Department of Fish and Wildlife needs the impoundment to flood up waterfowl habitat. A fish ladder or a bypass channel would allow the boards to remain in place while providing for fish passage, meaning that the Department of Fish and Wildlife would no longer need to choose between what is best for salmon and what is best for waterfowl. Here are two views of the check dam. On the left, water is leaking through the boards and there is no downstream passage for juvenile salmon. In the photo on the right, Los Rios Farms removed the top center board so that there could be a defined flow over the top of the dam for juvenile salmon. As Mackenzie mentioned, this is much better condition for out-migrating salmon. We could have been doing this for 20 years, but thanks to Mackenzie, we're starting to do this now. Los Rios Farms has been a great cooperator. To create this centered flow, this deeper area, they just removed this center board of the 5 boards that go across the dam with each foot of elevation. This condition is something we hope to maintain in future years and have more success without migrating juveniles, particularly after April 1 when the check boards go in. For many years, we assumed that by April 1st, the water would be too warm for salmon to pass. Mackenzie's data has shown us that in fact, salmon can indeed pass this area even into May. And so this is an example of an adaptation of our continuous learning about salmon and how to improve our success. So now I'll talk a little bit about the possibility of a fish ladder. This is what a fish ladder looks like. On the left is a typical installation. This is not at Los Rios Check Dam, but it would look something similar, and the ladder would connect to the center notch of the dam and provide a way for salmon to pass even with most of the boards intact. While a fish bypass channel is the preferred solution, it could take years to obtain all necessary permits, whereas a fish ladder may only require a 1600 permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This means that a fish ladder could be installed as an interim solution until a bypass channel can be built. SQA would purchase a fish ladder when we have the required permit to install it. The photo on the left is a typical installation. On the right, you can see the baffles that allow fish to ascend the ramp. There's been a lot of excitement about the possibility of a fish ladder. We seem to be getting support from senior Department of Fish and Wildlife fish biologists, and it was the recommended solution of the National Marine Fisheries Service when they visited Putah Creek years ago. But really, a fish bypass channel is the more natural, more ideal way to move salmon around Los Rios Check Dam without having to remove all the checkboards. Here's a conceptual diagram of the proposed fish bypass channel. Los Rios Check Dam is in the upper right at the top of an S-shaped bend in lower Putah Creek. So Putah Creek is flowing this way and it comes up like this and it comes around to the dam up here. The low point in the channel, the natural spill point, is in this lower bend of the S-shaped curve. The fish bypass would direct the flow to the north, so it would come around like this, and then join the channel that leads to the tow drain downstream of Los Rios Check Dam. It's again about 12 feet of elevation when all the boards are in at the check dam. And so to enable fish to pass, we would build rock weirs at every foot of elevation drop, which is where these little markers are noted, including, so half of the drop would occur in this bypass channel, and then there would be a series of rock veins in the channel below the check dam to help raise the water surface elevation so that it would be an easier passage around and into Putah Creek or back out again for juvenile fish. Adult salmon, as shown in Mackenzie's data, begin to enter the tow drain in September. So the bypass channel would need to operate from at least early October until the check boards are pulled to accommodate flood flows, and again in the spring after the boards go back to allow for escapement of juveniles. This is kind of a blurry photo, but it shows a series of rock veins that we installed on Pleasance Creek west of Winters. The purpose was not fish passage, but you can see how they trap water in pools, even at very low flows. There's practically just a trickle of water going through and a series of pools behind rock weirs. And in a similar fashion, a natural fish ladder could be created with a series of rock veins. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the Road 106A seasonal crossing and impoundment. Here's a photo aerial view of the crossing and impoundment. It's an earthen crossing that's pushed across the creek. There's culverts here on the north side that allow flows to pass. So Road 106A is a seasonal earthen impoundment and crossing that also operates from April 1 until the check boards are pulled at Los Rios Check Dam. The two culverts on the north end of the crossing allow passage of low flows. The center third of the crossing is dug out every fall to allow flood flows to pass. The channel below the crossing is in surprisingly good shape, clearly benefiting from the contribution of soil for the channel to form itself in a narrower meandering pattern. A proposed permanent solution would be to replace the earthen crossing with two modular concrete bridge sections, each 20 feet wide. This width of the channel here is about 120 feet. And we could have a series of rock veins beneath the concrete modular bridge sections to check up the water, which is done for agricultural diversions. But the farmers don't need all of this width. In fact, this volume above the impoundment is trivial. The farmers are relying on the flow of the creek for agricultural diversions, and they just need to raise the elevation to keep their pump intakes below water. And so they would be open. This is Los Rios Farms that currently farms this property, and it's actually now owned by the city of Davis. The south part here and the north part here is controlled by the city of Davis with a conservation easement. So but the farmers and the city of Davis would be open to narrowing this channel to creating better aquatic habitat with perceptible flows. And we could still have the impoundment, but if we had a narrower channel, we could have more shade over the water. This is actually all width of open water here. So there's nearly 100 feet of open water on the face of the crossing. Our consulting geomorphologist, Rick Poor, is working on the proposed design for a modular concrete bridge and series of rock veins to allow fish to pass underneath a modular bridge. This would eliminate the need to take out the impoundment and in coordination with removal of the checkboard. So it would be an easier system for the farmers to manage, and the crossing could be available for a longer period of time. It's supposed to come out by permit on October 15, but nobody's really made an issue out of it as long as the checkboards weren't being removed. So it's still, for the time being, we need to coordinate the removal of this seasonal crossing with the pulling of the checkboards to allow salmon to pass. Here's the picture of the seasonal crossing from ground level. In the foreground are the two intakes for the two culverts. And here's where they discharge on the downstream end. This was the outflow from the culvert as it was about a month ago. An analysis by Mark Gard of Department of Fish and Wildlife finds that the culverts are impassable to salmon, so they can only get through when the road is breached. This is a shot of the impoundment looking upstream. Again, very overly wide, highly exposed to solar radiation and thermal exchange with the air. The channel could be narrowed considerably, still past the same amount of flows, but have a possibility of floodplains and shade over the water, creating a shadier, cooler condition, and also discouraging aquatic weeds. The proposed treatment of the upstream reach is to fill alternating sandbars to introduce a narrower meandering pattern that is more natural and would diversify the habitat. So here you can see in this channel, this wide impoundment upstream of the crossing, that we would fill alternating sides of the creek, and that would result in a narrower, meandering, more natural channel with much greater diversity of habitat. These fill areas become outstanding places to plant willows and cottonwoods, whereas currently the channel is very steep walled into open water, and there, aside from almost a single row of trees along the top, there's very little canopy cover, very little shade over the water. So that brings us to beaver dams. This is the dam that I've dubbed the Grand Coulee of Putah Creek. Mackenzie and Dennis breached this dam in about an hour. Oh, for the energy of youth. In the future, SQUA will coordinate with UCD to go looking for adult salmon if they suddenly stop arriving in future years. So that brings us to scarification, which is the way that we recondition gravels in the bottom of the creek so salmon can use them for spawning. Scarification is the act of scarifying, that is, raking the ground, or in this case, the floor of the channel, harshly, according to Webster's dictionary. But salmon don't find this harsh at all. Why scarify? We scarify because the floor of the creek becomes cemented with an asphalt-like crust about 6 to 8 inches thick, rendering otherwise suitable habitat unusable by salmon. Salmon preferentially spawn in scarified sites because it's easier to dig their redds. This cobble was 80% embedded on the floor of the creek with only the top exposed. Caddisfly colonized the exposed rock, but would have colonized all of a loosened cobble. This is significant not only for salmon, but for aquatic invertebrates generally, that form the base of the food chain for all wildlife. Birds nesting up to 1,000 feet from the creek feed primarily on adult forms of aquatic insects because their productivity dwarfs terrestrial insects. Scarification is needed in part due to the lack of scouring flows, here defined as 3,000 cubic feet per second or greater. Since Monticello Dam was built in 1957, scouring flows that used to occur every year are now a relatively rare event and don't happen at all in drought years. Prior to Monticello Dam, we used to get regular flows of 5,000 CFS every year and 5-year recurrence interval peaks of 50,000 CFS. Post-dam, we get about 1/10 of that. So the lack of scouring flows allows sediment to fill in the gravels and then create a hard asphalt-like surface that requires an excavator to reach in and break up the surface of the encrusted gravel. Where we've done this, we found that there's deep and loose gravel underneath as far as we can reach. It goes very fast, about 1 mile a day, and would be faster still, except that the top speed of an excavator is about 5 miles an hour. Here are sites that we've scarified so far. All of these sites have been in the vicinity of winters, mostly upstream of 505, and now extending about 3 miles downstream of 505. Additional sites are possible, and some require reworking after high flows, especially where sand is deposited over the top of previously loosened gravels. Some of our scarified reaches have become so deeply buried in sand that we're awaiting the next scouring flow, that is when the glory hole at Lake Berryessa spills, to blow out the sand on top of the spawning beds so that we can access those gravels again, loosen them again, and turn them back into viable salmon spawning habitat. Scarification leads to geomorphic restoration. Scarification converts the cemented shallow U-shaped gravel bed into a narrower, deeper channel with a defined thalweg that is the lowest point longitudinally in the creek. So there's no defined thalweg in the pre-scarified condition. It's just pretty much flat bottom. And with a defined thalweg, we get higher velocities in the center. So velocities are determined by water depth. So at the deepest point, you'll get the fastest moving water. Salmon preferentially spawn in these deeper areas, but trout can spawn at the same time in the shallower margins of the channel, and they don't require as large of gravels. So we're getting habitat differentiation, and all we did was loosen the gravel. Nothing was added, nothing was removed, and yet we're getting this fabulous change into a more natural, more functional stream channel. So as the channel gets deeper, the water surface elevation also drops and exposes a part of the bank that was previously inundated. And in most of Putah Creek, this is a little bit deceiving. The bank doesn't really flatten out. It typically rises steeply, such that there's very little planting service here, except that after we scarify, we expose this shallow margins of the wetted channel. And it's just, this is ideal habitat for riparian plants. So this is the boardwalk and the park place of planting sites next to the creek. And again, all created simply by loosening the gravel, one of the simplest things we do to get one of the most profound benefits that we've experienced in my history working on Putah Creek. And this is what the outcome looks like. Here's an example of a scarified channel that was originally twice as wide. Note the low edge of the floodplain, perfect for willows and cottonwoods. Do I sound like a horticulturalist? That's my background. So here's an example of plantings right along the edge of the creek. And this is turning into very marvelous habitat. The first time I saw this reach, it was very steep walled with arundo on both banks. And it was even claustrophobic because of the arundo encroachment. But most of the channel was overly wide and shallow, that kind of U shape. And now we have miles of habitat that are narrower and faster flowing, and the salmon have responded. We also need rearing habitat, and Ken Davis placed an underwater camera under this fallen alder tree and witnessed these salmon fry and juveniles. And this is ideal habitat for them. The brush provides lots of cover. The little fine branches provide substrate for aquatic invertebrates, particularly black flies, one of salmon's, the juvenile salmon's favorite foods. So they have cover and they have food service. Pretty good life if you're a juvenile salmon. So rearing habitat consists mainly of woody debris that provides cover and a buffet of aquatic insects colonizing the tops of an alder that died and fell into the creek. Alders do not tolerate prolonged flooding, and in the last high flow event, about half of the alders died. Alders only grow along the edge of the creek, and so when they die, it's natural for them to fall into the creek. And if they fall in and the roots remain embedded in the bank, they provide wonderful habitat for young salmon. This particular alder was just downstream of a red, so the fish emerged and immediately had a nice rearing cover to await the signal to move downstream and back out to the ocean. Were it not for underwater video, we would not have known there were juvenile salmon here. Their camouflage is nearly perfect when viewed from above. So that concludes my presentation of coming attractions. And thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Rich. And thanks to all of our speakers, Mackenzie and Peter. So now we can open it up to Q&A. If anyone has any questions for any of our speakers, Mackenzie, Rich, or Peter, I know I have a few in my chat, but if you want to submit some, you can submit it in the chat function, and then we can read them off to our speakers to get some feedback from them. So I have the first one for Mackenzie. Victoria is asking, could you explain what an otolith is and how a rotary screw trap works? And then, is there any mortality in the trap?
Those are really excellent questions, and I'm really sorry I forgot to address what an otolith is. An otolith is essentially the ear stone of a fish. We also have ear stones. They have 3, but it's a calcified structure, and most calcified structures grow as we grow, or grow as the salmon grows. And so in that way, we're able to like look back at its life history. And a rotary screw trap, I don't know if you can recall the picture I had, but it's essentially a big metal cone that spins, and as it sits between 2 pontoons. And so the cone spins as water enters it. The flow of the creek is what rotates the cone. And so there are baffles within the cone that prevent fish from leaving once they've entered. And so once they've entered the cone, there's another box at the back that they'll wait in until I go out to the trap and get them out. And as far as mortality goes, every once in a while, there's some mortalities in the trap. The trap is not picky in what it fishes for. So occasionally there will be a big sucker or a big bass or something else large, like a log or something, that ends up in the trap. And juvenile salmon sometimes get bullied a little bit in the trap. But there is some incidental mortality, but generally not very much.
Great. And then this next one is for Rich. Victoria is asking how the restoration work along the creek is funded.
Thank you for the question. The restoration work along the creek is mostly funded by grants. The Putah Creek Accord rather wisely devoted most of the funding to monitoring. And on top of that, Solano County Water Agency has been very generous about funding additional studies above and beyond the requirements of the Accord. We do have a small budget for vegetation management, but fish habitat work is generally dependent upon grants. Fortunately, there are a lot of organizations that are interested in improving fish habitat, especially the Delta Conservancy, and their programs tend to be undersubscribed. So they would be a perfect candidate to fund some of these fish passage issues that are in the legal delta.
Great. And then Earl has a question about the Accord. He asked, is the Accord accommodating of climate change? If drier conditions are in the future, will allowance be made for fish sustaining flows versus other diversions?
I'd like to take a shot at that. So the Accord wisely created a committee to look after Putah Creek in perpetuity. So the Lower Putah Creek Coordinating Committee is made up of representatives of the original parties to the litigation. So that would be Putah Creek Council, the City of Davis and UC Davis, and the water interests. And so that gives us a board that we can use to help adapt. And as I mentioned, we're a learning organization. The reason we focus so much of our budget on monitoring is that we want to know what is the right thing to do, and realizing that we're continuously learning and our idea of the right thing to do is constantly changing. I've learned a tremendous amount from Mackenzie just this past year, about the need to bring salmon into the system earlier. And we are beginning to take actions to do just that. So part of that adaptation is the grants that we apply for, the projects that we come up with. There are other things that we would do regardless that will help with climate change, creating more shade over the water, narrowing the channel so the flow moves faster. We have shorter residence time. When we narrow the channel, we have less exposure for thermal exchange with the air, less exposure for solar radiation. These are the principal factors that degrade water quality and the principal impacts that we would expect from climate change. So climate change or not, I think we would want to do these things because it's simply good for habitat. But in the face of climate change, they may be essential to the health of the ecosystem even more so.
Great, yeah. And we have one for Peter. Anne is asking about the flow rates along Putah Creek. So she asks, what are ideal flow rates for salmon in lower Putah Creek? Do juvenile fish and spawning adults prefer the same flow rates or different flow rates? And the last part of the question is, do high flow rates need to be maintained within the creek from spawning to out migration?
Well, you know, the nice thing about Chinook salmon is that they're designed to, they evolved to with the California climate. They're, you know, take advantage of these streams that are generally going to be too warm in the summer for salmon because they have very low flows. And then in the winter, the flows peak up and the temperatures go down and the salmon move in. So, you know, what you want, of course, for these fish are Goldilocks flows, that it's not too high so it blows them out, but not too low so the water is too warm or they can't get past barriers. There's no really straightforward answer to that question because the different life stages do require different flows, but or do like things a little bit different. But the an example of how this works so well, because we have to consider more than just salmon in the creek, but these flows that are part of the accord that come into the spring, where the stream flows are elevated. That's what's pushing those baby salmon out. At the same time, though, they're creating spawning and rearing flows for the native fishes. So flows are a tricky question, but basically we know what the minimums are for these fish, so we can work that out accordingly. I don't think I answered the question very well, but it's a very complex question, actually.
Yeah. So Anne Costello has a question about invasive snails and what their effect are on habitat in general, and then fish in particular.
I'd like to
go ahead. Go ahead, Rich.
Just in the way of background, Ken Davis, our aquatic photographer who produced so many nice pictures for my presentation, has been studying Putah Creek long before I knew who he was. And he went out to fishing access number 3 in the Inter Dam Reach, about halfway between Monticello Dam and Putah Diversion Dam. And he sampled aquatic insects to take home to his lab and photograph under a microscope. And he was out in March of 2003 and saw nothing unusual at all about the organisms in the bottom of the creek. By October, by Halloween, when he returned to take some more samples, the bottom of the creek was covered with New Zealand mud snails, an invasive species. The snails had hitched a ride on the boots of fishermen, and they were known to be in California, but east of the Sierras. I think Putah Creek was one of the first discoveries of mud snails west of the Sierras. And Ken was astute enough to recognize what they were. And so the water agency realized that we needed to get some baseline information about aquatic invertebrates to even be able to answer this question of what effect was this invasive species having. In some other water systems, 97% of the invertebrate biomass could be New Zealand mud snails. Fortunately, on Putah Creek, it doesn't seem to be quite that extreme, but we have baseline data now to show that for the most part, what Peter said about reconciliation ecology, about alien and native species getting along, seems to be true of Putah Creek. We haven't seen any drastic impact on our fish populations. As a matter of fact, Department of Fish and Wildlife has stopped stocking trout in the Inter Dam Reach. And the fish, the native fish, have recovered and are now producing as many offspring, so that fishermen basically are catching fish at about the same rate, about 30 minutes to catch a fish on average, from surveys of fishermen in the Interdam Range. So the trout don't seem to be affected. There is, I think there are a couple of invertebrates whose populations are suppressed by New Zealand mud snails. But fortunately, mud snails like the slower, weedier reaches of the creek. So as we restore the creek, as we increase the flow velocities, we're having a suppressing effect on New Zealand mud snails. We are probably going to have to live with them for quite some time. They have no natural enemies in Putah Creek. But so far, we haven't seen the worst that we thought might happen.
No, if I could add to that, in many of the places where mud snails were regarded to be a major problem in the West, like in the Green River below, some of the big dams there, the snails have just about disappeared, or they become a very minor part of the fauna. So a lot of these invasive species like this that come in, they become a problem for short periods of time, but then the system adjusts to them. And I'm sure there are predators actually on these snails. We just don't know what they are yet. Even trout will feed on snails. They aren't a particularly good food, but they will take them. I know sculpins will eat snails to a pretty large extent. So my expectation is that the mud snails will remain in the creek, but they, as Rich was indicating, it doesn't appear to be a major problem. And certainly from a trout perspective, there's very little evidence in most of the places where mud snails have invaded that they've really affected trout populations much, or perhaps slowed down growth some, but even that hasn't never really been demonstrated, which is good that they're less of a problem than everybody thought they would be.
All right, and then we have a question from Turid. I think this is in reference to the 106A road, but she asks that Rich, you talked about the advantages of narrowing the channel. Does this lead to increased downcutting of the creek, or is a floodplain created at the same time?
Well, thank you for the question. We are creating a floodplain at the same time. And that's the short answer, because the soil that's used to fill the creek has to come from somewhere. And coming from the margins of the creek is a logical place. So we're lowering the edge of the creek and creating better floodplain access. And because we're borrowing material on site, we're not changing the cross-sectional area of the channel. So we're not changing the flood capacity. We're not accelerating the flows. We're just changing the geometry.
Interesting. Okay. We have a question from Kate Laddish. She's asking, what's the signal to juveniles that it's time to head downstream? Is it environmental or based on age of fish or something else? And does the timing or signaling change each year, or is it fairly constant?
Mackenzie should answer that one.
Yeah, I can answer that. But jump in, Peter and Rich, if you have something to add, please. So my guess is that it's probably a combination of both. I think that the juvenile salmon largely follow environmental cues to move downstream, and these are things like flow and temperature. But as they grow, they'll also begin to change physiologically. And whether or not that physiological change is cued by the environment or if it's an internal cue, I am not positive. Perhaps Peter might have more to add. There was more to the question. Allie, what was it?
They were just asking, does the timing of the signaling change each year, or is it fairly constant?
I would suspect that it can change, especially because water years can be highly variable. So in years where we're experiencing more drought, there's less environmental flow and water temperatures are warmer. So perhaps the fish would be cued environmentally to outmigrate earlier in the season, as opposed to in a wet year, there's more flows and temperatures would generally be cooler.
Yeah, the fish could respond to a number of variables, but obviously that's why these flow regimes work, why the elevated flows in the spring work to push the salmon out. And you have several weeks of those flows, and the salmon of different sizes are moving out at slightly different times. So they're clearly responding to this combination of flow and temperature, and probably, but there are other factors as well. Even light, the length of the daylight, can make a difference for out migration times. But these fish have, they evolved in a variable environment, and they seem to know how to handle it. Of course, we managed to screw things up in lots of ways, but the fish are still there.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that I have at the moment. If anyone wants to submit last minute questions to the chat, we can answer those really quickly. I think, Mackenzie, you wanted to pose a question to the group.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Allie. I wanted to ask you all if there was something about salmon or fish or Putah Creek in particular, any of the above, that you want to know more about, because I think that's really important, right? Putah Creek is a common good and it belongs to everybody. And so I'm interested in knowing what you're interested in. And I think you guys can share your answers with us in the chat if you want, but also, Allie, are they able to unmute at all?
Yeah, they can unmute and ask, or ask any questions, or provide any feedback. That's totally fine. But we can just wait for those questions to come in or comments, and I'll just do a little wrap up in the meantime, and we can kind of touch back to it if we have any more questions or comments. But I just wanted to say I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today and coming to this talk. Like I said earlier, it was kind of a brainchild of necessity. We got so many questions that were posed to Mackenzie, to Putah Creek Council, to Rich, and I'm sure Peter as well. Got a ton of questions from the public about Chinook salmon along Putah Creek. And so we thought we would just put something together so that people could maybe get some of those questions asked. And hopefully, if we continue this into the future, we'll be able to track kind of the progress of what's going on along the creek. So that's kind of the goal of this whole thing. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we have our Creek Speak presentations start this month, actually, and May 20th. And our next presentation is on environmental justice in the Central Valley. So that's super interesting. If anyone wants to register for that, the link is actually in the chat for them to do so. I think we have one more question from Stephen. I love being able to see the spawning salmon as they head upstream. Are there ideal places to watch them without disturbing?
Well, the bridges make a marvelous viewing platform. It's very nice of the county to build these bridges so we could go out and view the salmon when they're spawning. And Peter predicted that in winters, that salmon could be spawning under the Winter's Car Bridge, and we'd be able to view them from the adjacent railroad bridge if we narrowed the creek and we put gravel in the creek. At the time that Peter said this, it was astonishing because the channel was about 15 feet deep and 90 feet wide and didn't look like salmon spawning habitat at all. In fact, the salmon spawned 3 years after Peter summoned them. And invited them, saying that we were now more hospitable and they should give us a try. And in fact, salmon were spawning in the midst of the bridge construction when the new Winter's Car Bridge was built. There was a wooden deck to protect the creek underneath the bridge, and the salmon would hide underneath the wooden deck, and then they would come out into the sunlight and spawn adjacent to the cover. So in spite of all the activity, I can't imagine how they were able to tolerate so much disturbance. The salmon are usually a bit shy, but they like that big deck and all that cover that was provided for them. And Peter's prediction came true.
I would say that other place to observe salmon is below Mace Boulevard. There's some spawning places where they seem to spawn in years where there are many adults in the creek. There's always a cluster that seem to spawn later than the others down off Mace Boulevard, right by the by the city park there. And they can often be seen by standing up on the bank looking down on them. So that's usually somebody reports them when they're there. And then I've been out there when there have been literally dozens of people looking at them, but the salmon were not disturbed because the people were all up on the banks. So yeah, hope for a lot of salmon in the creek. The more salmon we get, the easier they are to see, and the more likely they're to be spawning in unlikely places.
And Ken Davis took a picture of people leaning over the Winter's Car Bridge, which now has plenty of room for pedestrians, and he called it the Fanny Bridge. You know, looking at the salmon.
Awesome. I don't see any more questions, just some people putting in their little, what they'd like to see in the future. But I think that's it for questions.
Just a quick statement, if I could.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Often you can see fish at the Pedrick Road overcrossing as well, or just down from there. In addition, several years ago, I went for a late night walk, full moon and so forth. And oh my God, it was after midnight. And I took my big flashlight and looked in the channel underneath the I-80 bridge, and there were 3 salmon in there spawning. There's not much gravel there, but geez, when there's a lot of fish around, they seemingly take advantage of whatever they can. Thank you.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great observation. It is one of the interesting problems with Putah Creek is that the number of places that there's really good spawning gravel are not that many. It's mostly concentrated in the areas that Rich has talked about around the diversion dam. But any place, a lot of these places where they seem to be spawning, there's clay underneath, and there are tractors and gravel that's perched on the clay. I often wonder if they actually spawn or just dig for a while and then give up. That Highway 80 place would sound like one of those, but that's a neat observation, actually.
I noticed a question from Victoria about if there used to be steelhead trout in Putah Creek.
Yes, there did, but not since the dam was built. When the dam was under construction, there was a big run of steelhead coming up, and people were fishing right below the dam while it was under construction, partly because there's really high flows then. The steelhead used to come up and spawn into tributaries to the Berryessa Valley. And to this day, there are populations of trout in Lake Berryessa that behave like steelhead. And I'm convinced they're the progeny of the original wild steelhead that got trapped behind the dam. But there's some places, some of the creeks that flow into the creek will get a very nice runs of fairly large fish running up the creek. And you go back later, you find zillions of small ones. So, but when you get down below the dams, I keep looking hoping that somebody will catch a big steelhead. And once in a while I'll run into people who claim they have, but I've never gotten anyone to verify it for me. So as far as I know, there are no steelhead below the diversion dam in Lower Putah Creek. There could be. Certainly the opportunity is there, but we've just never seen them. I might add that at one point we looked at a bunch of the juvenile salmon below the diversion dam, and looking at otoliths again. That was a long time ago, and we figured out that they were all resident fish. There's no evidence of any anadromous fish.
Very interesting. All right. Well, I don't see any new questions in the chat. So I will just thank our speakers. Thank you, Mackenzie and Rich and Peter, for taking time out to do this tonight. This was great. And I will thank our audience for joining us and having great questions and engaging with us. This was really awesome. And like I said before, we have more of these sort of talks happening from May until October, one happening each month. So if you're interested in learning more, they won't necessarily be salmon focused, but there'll be lots of other stuff that we can learn from. So thank you everyone for coming. And with that, I think we can end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.